Just to give some context about where I came from, how I got here. Some of the sort of hall committee has heard already. I hope that even those of you who are here, that there is some new information.
Do they hear any voices?
So I grew up in rural Vermont on a dirt road off of another dirt road. And I actually didn't go to church growing up. I was not super religious. In Vermont, there are 2 ELCA congregations in the entire state, neither which were near where we lived. And my grandfather was a Lutheran pastor, and so my mom wasn't interested in church hopping, and so really let me just sort of explore and figure out on my own. I give a lot of credit to that, actually, because I think if I had been raised in the congregations that were nearby, I don't know if I would be a pastor today. And my high school was really international. We had a lot of boarding students, and so when I was looking at colleges, I'm going to see if standing a little further from the speaker helps us out. So when I was looking at colleges, I ended up going to NYU Abu Dhabi, which is in the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East, and that was again a very international school. It was a space where I became even more comfortable in interfaith and ecumenical spaces, and it was actually a really beautiful time of spirituality because we were in a country where the call to prayer was just broadcasted 5 times a day, and something that we sort of took on as a practice of being a guest. Any advice for folks who have led forums on where I should stand right now? Away from the speaker. Great. We'll go center. Let's check that. That's a little better. Great. And so the call to prayer happened 5 times a day, and so those of us who weren't Muslim, which was a large portion of our college, still just took that time to pause and reflect. If there were conversations happening during lunch when the call to prayer happened, we just stopped and we waited, and it was okay. And it was really formative and wonderful. And I was originally a poli-sci major, but switched to the arts. So I was a theater major, which I had done some in high school, and then did directing and lighting in college. Which then takes me to my arts practice. I grew up creating and crafting. I was sewing and knitting from a very young age. And then I ended up thinking of weaving as a theological framework. So a space where the warp threads, which need to have a lot of tension, and the weft threads, which can be more delicate, interweave to create the fabric. You need both. You need tension, and you need support, and you also need beauty and texture. My thesis piece in college was an adaptation of the Stations of the Cross, so the 13 Stations of the Cross, but using a loom instead of a cross, and we wove on it during the piece, and we were exploring gender and ritual and sacred spaces. And that practice of weaving has since kind of continued in my life, including doing some arts integration with churches. So the picture on the far right is a Lenten altar cloth that I led my home congregation in weaving over the period of Lent. So as I mentioned earlier, my grandpa was a Lutheran pastor. That's actually a picture of him at my baptism, where I screamed the entire time. That is the main story that I have, is it was loud. And even though I didn't grow up going to church, I grew up visiting his congregation. And who he was as a pastor deeply shaped me as a pastor. He was always very welcoming. And so unlike a lot of my other LGBTQIA+ siblings who had kind of this rupture from church, I never did because my grandpa was my image of the church. And he had an openly gay intern before 2009 in the ELCA, and that was his favorite intern. And I always heard those stories growing up, and I always knew how much my grandpa loved me. And so when he died in 2014 and I went to his funeral, the place was packed. He was serving a congregation in Toms River, New Jersey, and he had previously served there and had been retired for a few years. And I could just feel the Holy Spirit in that place in a way that I hadn't before, and it felt very much like some of the ritual spaces that we had been creating in our theater practices, in our arts practices. And the pastor who was doing communion, who I also knew from growing up, teased me a little because I wasn't taking communion. Again, I was a junior in college at this point, so important to know that I'm not a tiny human in this story. But I had never been confirmed, and in my grandpa's church, the practice was you were confirmed before you took communion, which is not the practice everywhere, but was at the time when I was growing up. And so I reached out to that pastor who made a joke about me still not taking communion as a junior in college, and asked him, if I want to start exploring this church thing again, what do you recommend? How do I know that I'm going to a congregation that is affirming? How do I know that it's going to be a space that's good? And his recommendation was to look at the RIC website, to look at the Reconciling in Christ database. I was in New York for that semester, and so found a church that is literally a stone's throw from Stonewall, which is the site of some of the early LGBTQIA+ protests and riots for equal rights. And the pastor was a theater person as well. And so I was like, cool, I'm a college theater major interested in exploring faith. I'll just go check it out. That's a person I can have a conversation with, even if nothing comes of it. Turns out that pastor's that pastor's father and my grandpa went to seminary together in this small Lutheran world where the Holy Spirit was saying, I know you don't really want to be doing this right now, and I'm just going to keep showing up. And that was something, like, my family had lost touch with Pastor Mark's family. They didn't know he was in New York. I genuinely, randomly chose this congregation because it was within walking distance and had an arts focus. And so I started going to church that summer, and then went back to Abu Dhabi for my senior year. I did not engage in the church community there because it tended to be more conservative, the folks who were there, and then moved to Chicago. And when I moved to Chicago, I started attending St. Luke's Lutheran Church of Logan Square, where I met my spouse, who we will hear from in a minute, to share a bit about himself. And I was on council, I served as a small group leader, I did worship leadership, and it was in that place that I discerned a call to ministry. I had already been thinking about going to seminary to take a few classes to bulk up my theological framework, because I had this arts framework. I was exploring a lot of Christian themes and religious and ritual themes in my artwork, and I wanted to have that theological backing as well. And then the 2016 election happened, and that is what shifted me from thinking I'm just going to take a few classes to I'm going to go to seminary full-time. Because I deeply believe that faith communities at their best are places where we can practice living together in ways that are different than how the world wants us to live together, and are ways that can really nourish and support and build community in ways that we don't often see outside. And I wanted to be part of that, and I felt like I could be effective in that. And then just for other photo contexts, the middle photo is a chalice and communion plate, and then the photo on the right is my spouse and I at a pride parade representing St. Luke's. So my faith formation, once I had discerned a call to seminary, I went to the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. I was already in Chicago. It made sense My grandpa had taught there way back in the day. The weaving together is just, there's a lot of connections. And they have a public church curriculum, which was something that I was really drawn to, of saying, how do we do church in the world? How do we do church in the world in a way that honors the diversity of beliefs and practices and supports each other in sharing the good news and the abundance of God's creation? One of the field placements that I did while I was there was I worked at Masjid al-Rabia, which was a queer affirming mosque in Chicago, doing a lot of admin support for them and continuing to further my commitment to interreligious work where we're not trying to convert each other. We're saying, you have deeply held sacred beliefs, I have deeply held sacred beliefs, and we have similar views on justice and what we want the world to look like, and how do we do that together. I was a commuter student at LSTC because I already lived in Chicago, and was in my final semester of classes when the pandemic onset. So that middle picture is the Holy Week, that first Holy Week of the pandemic, when everyone really just pivoted to keep each other as safe as possible. And so that was my office setup for that time at that field placement. And then I served a year of internship at St. John's Lutheran Church in New York City, which was the same congregation that I had gone to back in college for that summer. And that's a picture of the staff of that congregation on my last day. And the way that, so I did a final year internship, so I did all of my academic coursework and then went to internship just to not move myself and my pets more times than necessary. And so my internship was summer of 2020 through summer of 2021. And it was a time. In that time, my father also passed away during that time. This was a very small congregation, and we were just trying to figure out how to be together when it really wasn't super safe to be together. That congregation also hosted a drag gospel night, and that got so many people in the door. And it's just really a beautiful way of sharing space with the community, of saying, we have this space, come on in. And the liturgy that was developed for that drag gospel night wasn't actually driven by Pastor Mark, but was driven by the community, who then invited him in to, hey, we want you to pray, we want you to open this in service, we want this to be a liturgy. You have invited us into our building, and we are inviting you into our community. And then I met my spouse, Eric, at church in Chicago, which is not the most common story nowadays, but is what happened. And I'm just going to invite him to share a little bit about himself, because it will be weird if I did that when he is here.
You didn't want to talk about me while I was sitting right here? Hi, my name is Eric Fowler. My pronouns are he, him, his. A little more center. Okay. Trying it. I grew up in West Fargo, North Dakota. I went to Gustavus Adolphus in St. Peter, and then did, what brought me to Chicago was I did Lutheran Volunteer Corps. And so I did policy research at workforce development, advocacy, policy organization called the Chicago Jobs Council, and I went to St. Luke's Lutheran Church of Logan Square, which was my sponsor congregation for our volunteer house when I was doing LVC, Lutheran Volunteer Corps. Met Reed there, and then we both were interested in ending up in Minnesota long term, and I currently do policy advocacy and research around clean energy and eliminating carbon emissions, particularly from buildings, is my current focus. And in my free time, I like to give scritches to our pets, and I like to bake bread.
And we live in a housing co-op in St. Paul. So there are 6 adults who live in the space, and we share food and chores and build community there. Eric and I are the caretakers of 4 animals, 3 cats and an elderly doggo. Feel free to ask me more stories about them. Feel free to share your own stories of your beloved pets. They are gifts and challenges sometimes. So I want to shift here a little bit from kind of who I am, how I got here, to some of my theological frameworks and pastoral frameworks, because I think that's useful for y'all to know a little bit about what you'll hear from me pretty frequently, and find ways to connect in that way. So you may have noticed that to this point in the conversation, I haven't really talked about the fact that I'm trans. And that's largely because that was a period of discovery that happened largely in college. And so I felt really settled in, this is who I am, this is just how I live and move in the world, by the time I discerned a call to ministry. Just like I bet that most of you don't think about your gender too actively on a daily basis, aside from what clothes you wear or things like that. It's not actually an active thing that I think about super frequently at this point in time. But it does impact my theology. Queer theology has deeply shaped me, and a lot of what I consider my own queer theology is just my theology, because some of our identities are so deeply woven into who we are and how we live in the world. I'm very comfortable in in-between spaces, in those liminal spaces between what was and what could be, the joys and the griefs, and holding those together. Those liminal spaces, I'm comfortable in them, and that is something that has shaped my theology. And then also the ways that we can find our ways into texts in new and creative ways. So saying, well, we actually know that LGBTQIA plus folks, whatever they might have called themselves in time, have existed for as long as humanity has existed. That is just, it is a fact. It exists in many cultures, in many shapes and forms. The binaries that we try to put on things are largely just us trying to control a beauty of diversity and creation that we can't control, and we're trying to. And so another aspect of my theology is creation care. So how we respond to the beauty of God in the world, as well as disability justice. One of the reasons that you will continue to see me masking in most spaces is my commitment to disability justice and theology. We are still in an ongoing pandemic that has long-term impacts that we don't know yet. We don't actually know what the long-term changes are. We're still living in them. And I find myself pretty skeptical of folks who say, we know exactly what's going to happen next and what's going on, because we don't. It's a simple truth that we don't. I also live with someone who's pretty high risk, and so protecting him is also part of my commitment to this work. And so something that I think about a lot is how we increase access to our spaces. In the physical space, yes, but also through our bulletins, through our welcome. Because I didn't grow up going to church, I'll often look at church documents and say, I don't think I would know what that meant if I didn't go to seminary. Or I don't think I would know how to move in this space if someone hadn't told me how. And so that framework of welcoming the folks who haven't been coming to church since they were a baby, baptized, and all through, how do we welcome newer folks as well as honoring the traditions that make this place what it is? You'll also hear me preach a lot on themes of abundance. So I think we are in a false scarcity mindset in the world overall that causes us to turn toward individualism, when actually the way that we will protect each other and care for each other is sharing what we have and trusting that there is enough. There's enough housing, there's enough healthcare, there are enough resources that folks don't need to be struggling as much as they are. And so how do we as church lean into that abundance? my notes, here we go. And then something else that is really important to me is pastoral care and community care. So how do we create systems of care that we can plug into? How do we make sure that the work is intersectional so that it honors all of the diversity of identities that we bring and that our neighbors have? And then also focusing on mental health and grief work. Some training that I'll be starting in the next few weeks is to become an end-of-life doula. So some additional training to help folks as they are transitioning from what is now to what is next. And so a bit on my pastoral identity of images of who I am as pastor. Those of you from the call committee will recognize this image. One of the questions that was asked in the second interview was, what are your images of pastor and how does that inform your ministry? And so the three main pastoral identities that I focused on in there was pastor as community organizer, as fellow disciple, and as midwife. So pastor as community organizer. Again, kind of the systems of care that I've already touched on in this conversation, the ways that we can use what we have and what we can bring to further the abundance and further live into the work of God that's already happening and is already here. Pastor as fellow disciple, I think it's really important to name that we are also on the journey with y'all. We are on our own faith journeys and we are discovering and learning about Scripture and finding new things to be curious about and don't have all the answers. And then pastor as midwife. So holding those liminal spaces, holding the spaces because we know that in our bodies we carry joy and we carry grief. We carry the loss of what we have lost, and we also carry hope and excitement for things to come. And so how do we let ourselves be in those spaces? How do we let ourselves dwell in the mystery of God in a world that wants us to just keep going and not necessarily rest? And so that is also important to me. And then some of the things that I'm really excited about Grace particularly is that, where is it? Here it is. So that now there is this stability after a time of transition. And we know that we are all experiencing change and instability all the time and holding a lot of things at once. I shared in one of my interviews that the passing of the peace was something that felt like home because it went on for so long. And that is such a gift. It is so beautiful because it shows that this community wants to be together. You want to say hi to each other. You want to know what's going on in each other's lives. And that is such a gift. I am so excited to be working collaboratively with the other staff members and lay leadership. I really enjoy working collaboratively. It comes from a lot of my theater background. And so being able to share leadership, share ideas. And then there is also currently so much energy around what is next. This is a congregation that has experienced a lot of change and also has stayed really strong throughout that change, and so is discovering what it means to be church now and really taking time to explore that and listen to that. And to wrap up before we have a couple minutes for questions, just keep, I don't actually know what time forums are supposed to end. But I can't know where this partnership will lead to because we'll be following the Spirit together, but I'm really excited and grateful for what unfolds.
Yay.
Master Reed, we're excited to have you as part of the team.
Are there any questions? Anything that you're curious about? Anything that sparked interest? Yeah.
So Pastor Reed, what pronouns do you prefer then?
So I use both they, them, and he, him pronouns. I use them pretty interchangeably, so whatever is, however folks want. Yeah.
What are you currently working on from an art perspective?
So from an art perspective, one of the things I'm currently working on is I recently started spinning. So I had been knitting and sewing kind of from a very young age. I picked up weaving in college, and in the last 8 months, 6 to 8 months, like not actually that long, I picked up spinning as well. And that has been delightful, where it's a craft that you can just pick up for 5 minutes at a time, and so it fills kind of a good niche, but that's what I've been doing, a lot of spinning.
You mentioned something about that you are going to take a class to help people that I take it that are in hospice, that type of thing. Where's the training?
So it's through INELDA, which is an international end-of-life doula kind of organization. And I haven't started the training yet, so I can't speak too much of what it will hold, but it will both be kind of for folks in hospice, but also for home-based care, or even just getting better language around. We should actually all have our end-of-life documents in place, no matter what stage of life we're at. Like that's some work that Eric and I have done, and to encourage other folks to say, in your ideal world, what would it be like? And how can we put supports in place that, God willing, that is how it can go?
Will you bring that training back here to Grace?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
And is that training that you will be doing specifically for faith leaders?
It's not.
Oh.
Yep, it's not specifically for faith leaders, but folks kind of bring whatever their particular background and experience to it is.
So, my grandpa, sorry, it's really hard for me to talk about him. But anyways, he passed away 4 years ago. And so, he was in hospice, all of that stuff. So I just want to say that is incredible what you're going to be doing, because coming from somebody that had experience, whatever, and knowing that somebody was there with him praying and stuff like that, that is really special.
Yeah, one of the things that really excited me about this call specifically was that the job description had a lot of community care in it, and a lot of outreach and justice work, and those are two of the things that give me so much energy in ministry, that it's exciting to be able to really live into them and deepen that work. If there are no other questions, we'll, oh, no.
What's your animals, what's your guys' pets' names? Unless I missed it.
No, you didn't. So Ari is our doggo. She is a little bit over 12 years old and has some health stuff going on, as older doggos do. The fluffy cat is named Gizmo. She's about 9 years old. She is utterly perfect. And I say that objectively because one of the careers I held before coming into this work was as a dog and cat groomer. I was a dog and cat groomer for about 6 years, 5 years in Chicago, and then a year as a salon lead in the Twin Cities before getting this call, and so she is objectively perfect. Then we have Grayson, who is also about 9 years old, and he is not the smartest cat on the block, but he is very sweet. And then Whiskey is about 5 years old at this point, and we found her as a street kitten in Chicago, and have had her since she was about 6 weeks old.
So besides pets and theater and art, what do you do to recharge?
Yeah, so I'm also a gardener. So the sermon today fit very well.
Come on over, Reed.
And so, I do a lot of gardening. I also have some friends that I regularly hike with. So spending time outside is another way that I kind of recharge and refresh.
I noticed you have a tattoo on your arm. Is there a significance for that, and do you have any other tattoos?
There's many.
Didn't catch those.
Yeah, they all have various meanings that I kind of in individual conversations if folks want to ask, I'll share in those spaces on that. Yeah.
So will you have a weaving class? And when will it start and what time will it be?
Probably not a formal class, but I do hope to do some arts integration and some arts projects with the congregation. I think one of the things that always makes me so sad is when folks have this experience of being told as a child, like, you aren't good at this thing, you aren't good at drawing, you aren't good at art, and then also saying it's only for the kiddos, when actually we are all made in the image of a creator. And so we all have creativity and ways that we can practice that, and so I'm excited to bring that to the space.
Reed, you had mentioned in your newsletter communications that there's going to be some contact regarding signing up for one-on-one or personal.
Yes.
How do you see that unfolding?
So there will be both a mix of folks who have been reaching out to me directly already, and then this next week or two, I'll start sending out requests for one-on-ones. But if you want to chat more than just like the 5 minutes after service, you can just email me, and we can set up a time for that. And my email, like all of the staff's email, is my first initial dot my last name at graceofav.org. So r.fowler@graceofav.org, and that's also on the website.
So Pastor Reed, we are an aging congregation, and you and Pastor Sarah bring a lot of youth and energy. So I'd like to hear maybe some of the thoughts about bringing youth and younger generations into our congregation.
The way that I view growing a congregation is that the work speaks for itself. So if we are a congregation known to be welcoming, if we are a congregation known to be caring about what's happening in the world, that is what speaks to folks. There's so much where, like if there's all this energy of like, we're gonna do this program and this program and this program, but it's not actually grounded in a deep spirituality, it rings hollow to folks. And so aligning words and actions is one of the big ways that I view growing a congregation naturally, as well as saying, yeah, we are a community of faith. We are going to pray, we are going to take time to have these sacred spaces, and you're not going to find that everywhere. And that is what makes a faith community unique and what draws people to it.
Thank you.
I'm originally from Chicago, so I'm not, it could be age, but I can't remember Logan Square. Where is that located?
It's sort of just north of the Loop. Yeah. Like a little north of the Loop. Yeah. But yeah, I actually lived, I lived in Logan Square for about 6 months, but then I actually spent most of my time just in the south side in McKinley Park, Bridgeport area.
I know where that's at.
Yeah. One more call for, yes.
I probably just missed it, but when you made the choice for where you wanted to go to college, I'm trying to remember that you were in Dubai, but you were also Gustavus.
No, so
Who was in Gustavus?
Eric was the Gus.
Eric was.
Yeah.
I got okay.
Eric's the Gus.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah,
I wasn't listening very well, sorry.
But yeah, I was in Vermont, and then I moved to Abu Dhabi, and it was a degree granting institution, so I was there for 3 of my 4 years. And my junior study abroad, which I always say a little ironically, because my study abroad was in New York City, which is not abroad for me, it was a home study basically. And then after college, I was looking for a city that had a queer community, a faith community, and an arts community. I knew that New York City was too busy, and I had Chicago, Minneapolis, and Portland on my list, and ended up in Chicago, and now have ended up in the Twin Cities area.
When you were in Chicago, and you have much interaction with black churches, color communities there, especially on the south side?
A little bit. In some of the public church curriculum, we had pastors come and speak, and I would actually say it was more my internship site, because Manhattan is much more integrated than a lot of Chicago is, and so the drag community there was largely black individuals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How long have you two been married, and where did that take place?
So we got married twice, because we first got legally married in 2020 via Zoom, for various reasons, both church logistic reasons, and also my dad's health was not doing well, and we knew that he wouldn't make it to our eventual big party celebration. And then in 2022, last year, we did a larger celebration in our backyard. So we've been married since 2020 and also since 2022. Luckily, the dates are pretty close together, so we just take it as a relationship retreat in that stretch of time.
Just hang on.
I was just thinking that this congregation has a strong sense of interfaith dialogue, as people here know from Pastor John. And I think we want to continue, or I hope we continue that. And it sounds like some of your experience in the places you've lived is going to really add to that, understanding. So that's great.
Are you active within the community of Isaiah then? There seems to be a strong interfaith community in this area.
I know a little bit about them, but I haven't gotten too involved. The last 2 years, so I moved to the Twin Cities in 2021 when I finished internship. I spent the first year as a salon lead at PetSmart, and then this past year I was at the operations associate at Upstream Arts, which is a disability justice and arts org. And so between those job transitions, being in the call process, some of those connections are the ones that I'm excited to be able to start forming more. Yeah. Lovely, well,
How did you decide to go to school in the Middle East?
The simplest, truest answer is there was really good financial aid and they sent me a card in the mail. The more in-depth answer is that my high school, I went to it like it was my local public high school, but it was an independent school, so we had international boarding students, and so the ability to go to a new place with, again, a very international and diverse student body. There was no majority of any nationality. Was really exciting and really felt aligned with what I was interested in doing. I was originally a poli-sci major, which made sense to kind of go there, and then ended up doing theater instead because I was able to. And what I always tell folks is if I had to make the same choice at 18, I would go again. We were downtown, we were integrated with the local community, the shopkeepers knew us, we knew them. And then senior year, we moved to the permanent campus, which was much more isolated. And so then started replicating sort of the isolated liberal arts college, which is what I wasn't looking for. Yeah.
Interesting.
Do you have any siblings in your family?
Yes, I have one older brother who is 10 years older than me. He is still in Vermont. Yeah.
What were some of your favorite theater performances?
Oh, that's a great question. What are some good ones? There was a theater company that was in residence at my college called Theater Me Too, which is a New York-based company, but was in Abu Dhabi because their artistic director was the head of our theater program. And they did a lot of reimaginings of classics. So Death of a Salesman, but with puppets. or August Strindberg's Dream Play, but in this kind of big, giant theater space. And so a lot of the experimental, newer work was just really fun to experiment and play in.
What other languages do you speak?
I do not speak any other languages. I took Latin in high school, which is not a spoken language. And then I took a semester of Arabic, but Arabic actually isn't super widely spoken among the population of Abu Dhabi. It tends to be the upper class language. And then I took about a semester of Hindi from a local woman who taught it. At this point, I have lost all of that, but it was useful while I was there because Hindi or Urdu are much more common. Okay, gonna do it one more time. Last, any other questions? No, well, thank you for all staying after worship and listening to me talk for a while.